The US-Ukraine partnership, it seems to be falling apart.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly what
this. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
Right after this meeting, Volodymyr Zelensky was kicked out of the White House. Trump felt disrespected, and Zelensky's shrugging, eye-rolling, and exasperated sighs just made things worse. Now, imagine what happens next. What if Trump decides enough is enough and abandons Ukraine? No more weapons, no more funds, no more blank check support. It's safe to say that the world would watch in shock, but Europe would be the first to react. I mean, we've already seen how, within hours of Zelensky's tense meetings with Trump, over a dozen European leaders have reached out to assure him that they will stand with Ukraine's cause and offered unwavering support. But the real question is, will Ukraine really survive without US military aid? And why does this war matter so much more to Europe than it ever did to America? You see, for Europe, this war isn't just about geopolitics. It's more than that, because it's happening right in their own backyard. If Ukraine falls, then the EU will be living in fear of Russian tanks rolling further west. The countries closest to Ukraine, like Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Slovakia, understand this better than anyone. They know what it's like to live under Moscow's rule. For decades, they were trapped behind the Iron Curtain, controlled by the Soviet Union, forced to follow Moscow's orders, and stripped of their sovereignty. Cities like Warsaw, Tallinn, and Vilnius have lived through Russian domination. These countries fought back hard to break free from Soviet control, rebuilt their democracies, and secured their independence by joining NATO and the European Union. But now, with Russia waging war just right across their borders, the fear is real. If Ukraine loses, who's next? Zelensky himself has warned repeatedly that Putin won't stop at Ukraine. He specifically named Estonia, Latvia, Poland, Moldova, and Slovakia as potential targets. Why? Because many of these countries border Russia, and some even have Russian-speaking minorities. The same excuse Putin used to justify his annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Ukraine. That's why European leaders have made it clear that Ukraine's victory is Europe's security. Stopping Russia in Donbass is far better than fighting Russian troops in Warsaw or Riga. For example, when Hitler took Czechoslovakia in 1938, the world thought that would be enough, but it wasn't. When Russia took Crimea in 2014, some believed Putin would stop there, but as you can see, he didn't. But it's not just about military threats. This war has already cost Europe dearly, economically, socially, and politically. Millions of Ukrainian refugees have flooded into European countries, creating the largest displacement of people since World War II. Cities across Germany, Poland, France, and beyond have taken in millions of people, putting immense pressure on housing, jobs, healthcare, and social services. It's a humanitarian crisis, but one Europe cannot turn away from. At the same time, energy prices skyrocketed after Russia cut off gas supplies, leaving Europe scrambling for alternatives. Countries like Germany, Italy, and France were forced to rapidly shift energy policies, pushing up costs for businesses and households alike. Inflation soared, and industries across Europe struggled with supply chain disruptions as critical goods like grain, metals, and fertilizers became harder to secure. Before the war, Europe expected its economy to grow by 4% in 2022. After Russia's invasion, that number dropped below 3%. The war has drained billions from European countries, forcing governments to spend more on defense, energy, and refugee support. But as it turns out, Europeans are ready to pay this price because they know that the alternative is even worse. Since World War II, Europe has built its peace on one simple principle: borders cannot be changed by force. This rule has kept the continent stable for decades. But if Russia wins in Ukraine, that principle no longer exists. It means any strong country can invade any weaker neighbor and just get away with it. And suddenly, no country near Russia can ever feel truly safe again. Furthermore, it also doesn't help that Ukraine's experienced military is currently the most effective deterrent against a Russian attack on the EU. So if Ukraine falls, then Europe itself must face the bear. So if we look at all the aspects, the United States is surely invested in Ukraine's cause, but it also doesn't face any immediate territorial threat if Ukraine falls. So far, America's support for Ukraine has been all about principles: defending sovereignty, upholding international order, and weakening Russia's aggressive stance. These have been the driving forces behind the US's support, not because it's necessarily in America's direct self-interest. After all, a weaker Russian military means less of a threat to NATO and potentially deters China. But let's be real. If the US were to turn away from supporting Ukraine, it's not a big loss for them. Ukraine, however, has everything to lose. That's why the Zelensky-Trump fallout is such a huge deal for Ukraine. Europe's leaders were quick to voice their disappointment, and some are even signaling their readiness to go it alone if necessary. Their parliaments, which once hesitated about sending heavy arms, are now trying to outdo each other in pledging more support for Ukraine, just in case America pulls back. But here's the question, will it be enough? Because from the very start of Russia's full-scale invasion, American support has been nothing short of a lifeline for Ukraine. Between February of 2022 and the end of 2024, the US spent around $70 billion on military aid. That's more than every European country combined during the same period. If you factor in economic and humanitarian aid, the US contributions had topped $175 billion by early 2025. This money has funded weapons, intelligence, training, and logistics that have been absolutely crucial in shaping the outcome of the war. In January of 2025, a US State Department report detailed exactly what the US had provided to Ukraine. More than 200 155mm howitzers, along with a staggering 3 million artillery shells, have ensured Ukraine's firepower remains strong, especially as its Soviet-era stocks started running low. The US has also sent 40 HIMARS, the precision rocket launchers that completely changed the game in 2022. Thanks to US intelligence, HIMARS strikes were able to wipe out Russian ammunition depots and command posts, significantly crippling Russia's push forward. Without those rockets, Ukraine would have struggled to counter Russia's overwhelming artillery advantage. Then there's the air defense system. Russia's military and aircraft were a serious threat to Ukraine's cities, but the US stepped up big time with air defense. They provided at least 3 Patriot systems, same ones used to protect US air bases and allied capitals, along with a dozen NASAMS, hundreds of Hawk and Stinger missiles, and various radars and interceptors. These systems created a shield over cities like Kyiv, shooting down incoming cruise missiles and drones. The impact of US-provided air defense has been huge, preventing Ukraine's cities from facing the kind of relentless bombing that Russia inflicted on Syria. As long as Ukraine has Patriots and other SAMs with US missiles to resupply them, Putin can't just destroy Ukrainian cities with the same brutality. Russian attack helicopters and jets have also been forced to fly low, making them much more vulnerable and less effective. The anti-air weapons from the US have played a huge part in keeping Ukraine's skies safe. The US support has also been critical in giving Ukraine armor and mobility. The US sent more than 1,000 armored personnel carriers, hundreds of Stryker and Bradley fighting vehicles, and 31 M1 Abrams tanks, the first of which arrived in late 2024. On top of that, the US funded the refurbishing and transfer of hundreds of Soviet-era T-72 tanks from NATO allies. This flood of armor helped Ukraine equip new brigades and launch counterattacks. By the fall of 2023, American-supplied Bradleys were leading assaults in southern Ukraine, while US-provided engineering vehicles helped Ukrainian forces clear minefields and fortifications. Ukraine also received thousands of Phoenix Ghost and Switchblade kamikaze drones, alongside tens of thousands of Javelin anti-tank missiles. Those Javelins took out thousands of Russian tanks, and the Excalibur GPS-guided artillery shells allowed for pinpoint strikes on Russian positions. The US even gave Ukraine the ground-launched small-diameter bomb, a precision-guided missile with 150 kilometers of range, perfect for targeting Russian positions from a distance. Over time, the US steadily escalated the quality of weapons being provided, from basic Javelins early on to long-range game-changers like ATACMS missiles, which helped wipe out Russian helicopters at airfields. By late 2024, President Biden noted that the US had provided Ukraine with nearly every weapon they asked for, short of fighter jets. And let's not forget the integration of American hardware into Ukrainian operations. One Ukrainian officer even joked that with all the US armor, equipment, and vehicles, they looked like US Marines. That's how deeply US military support had become a part of Ukraine's war effort. Equally important, but often overlooked, is the US furnished intelligence, training, and logistical support that has supercharged Ukraine's war effort. While everyone focuses on the weapons, it's the behind-the-scenes data and strategy that has really made all the difference. US spy satellites and surveillance planes have been feeding Ukraine a constant stream of intelligence on Russian troop movements, missile launches, and specific high-value targets. This kind of battlefield awareness has allowed Ukraine to stay ahead of Russia's every move. Take the sinking of the Russian flagship Moskva in April of 2022. This wasn't just a lucky strike. US intelligence helped Ukraine pinpoint its location. This one strike boosted Ukrainian morale and shocked the Kremlin. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. US intel reportedly also enabled Ukraine to target and eliminate dozens of Russian generals and key supply hubs in the early days of the war. Now, the Pentagon insists that they don't provide intelligence on the exact location of senior military leaders or direct directly participate in targeting decisions. But in reality, without the real-time battlefield awareness provided by the US and NATO ISR, that's intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, Ukraine would have been fighting blind. Instead, they were often one step ahead thanks to America's eyes in the sky. US and NATO partners have also trained thousands of Ukrainian troops on Western tactics and sophisticated equipment. By mid-2023, about 67,000 Ukrainian soldiers had received training outside Ukraine, many of them under US command. These training sessions, held in the UK, Germany, and Poland, included everything from Western-style tactics to hands-on training with complex systems like Patriot air defense systems and Abrams tanks. Entire Ukrainian brigades even underwent combined arms training, supervised by US Army Europe, where tanks, infantry, and artillery worked in concert to perfect coordinated assaults. As a result, Ukraine's army became much more effective at breaching enemy defenses, as we saw during their summer of 2023 counteroffensive. US instructors were impressed by how quickly Ukraine adapted to NATO standards, showing just how transformative this training was under such intense pressure. And then there's the logistics network. This is where the unsung hero of Ukraine's resilience lies. The US organized and coordinated a vast system of military aid shipments, ensuring Ukraine's troops were always well-equipped and ready. US transport aircraft, along with European cargo hubs like Rzeszów in Poland, process an endless stream of ammunition, supplies, and equipment destined for the front lines. The US-European Command even set up a coordination cell to manage the flow of military aid among 50 different nations, ensuring that Ukraine got everything it needed, everything from winter uniforms to fuel. Without this steady flow of support, it's likely that Ukraine would have struggled to even survive the early stages of the war, let alone fight back. Thanks to US aid, Ukraine not only survived the initial onslaught, but has managed to go on the offensive. By 2023, Ukraine had reclaimed around 50% of the territory Russia initially seized in 2022. Every major Ukrainian victory has had US fingerprints on it. President Zelensky has repeatedly praised the US, expressing his profound gratitude for the help they've received. He emphasized that US aid has saved countless Ukrainian lives and is literally defending freedom on the European continent. So when you see it from that angle, it's hard to understate the importance of American involvement in this conflict. Now, what would happen if US support suddenly stopped? Well, the next day, or probably the very same day, European leaders would gather for an urgent strategy meeting, trying to figure out what to do next. You can almost feel the tension in the air because, let's be honest, without the US, there's going to be some big questions hanging over Europe. And it's not just about military aid, it's also about unity. So can Europe really step up and take charge? Well, between 2022 and 2024, Europe sent nearly €62 billion to Ukraine in military aid. That's a huge contribution. But now, with the US potentially stepping back, Europe will need to become Ukraine's primary armorer, banker, and intelligence source. That's a massive shift. And frankly, it's going to test the unity and capabilities of the EU like never before. A US withdrawal would instantly cost Ukraine about half its arms supply. And it's not just any weapons, it's the advanced systems that really make a difference, like the Patriots, the ATACMS missiles, and so on. Those are some serious capabilities that only a few European countries even have. Lithuania's defense minister even said that Europe just can't replace certain US assets. It's not just about stockpiles either. Europe's military wasn't really designed for a long, sustained war. Most European countries have been dwindling since the Cold War, so their stockpiles are lower than they really should be. Take artillery shells, for example. In 2023, Europe pledged to send 1 million shells, but it was a struggle. They ran into production bottlenecks and delays. Meanwhile, the US managed to send over 3 million shells. Why? Because the US has a huge defense industry and massive stockpiles. Europe doesn't have that kind of muscle, at least not yet. So can Europe really do it? Well, statistically, yes. Europe is trying to catch up, but it's not going to be an overnight fix. European factories are ramping up production and scaling up, but to be honest, they still need time. If the US stopped sending weapons today, Europe would need at least 6 months to start backfilling critical needs. 6 months is a long time in a war, especially when you're relying on artillery shells, air defense interceptors, and spare parts. Now, to give them some credit, Europe is starting to get it together. They've got plans to open up new production lines for ammo in Eastern Europe and to get the promised tanks and jets to Ukraine faster. The F-16 fighter jets, for example, are already coming from European air forces like Belgium, Netherlands, and Denmark, but there's still a lot of work to do. Ukraine is also working with its own defense industry to make up some of the gap, but they're still dependent on external help for a lot of it. So Europe does have some strengths here. Many of the systems Ukraine's been using are either European or Soviet-based, which makes the transition a bit smoother. For example, Germany's Leopard 2 tanks and France's Mamba air defense systems are already in use. These can help to replace US systems, at least in some cases. But there are still gaps. The US has been sending logistics vehicles, helicopters, communications gear, and satellite imagery, things Europe just doesn't have in the same quantity. Now, what about intelligence? Europe does have some strong players here too. Countries like the UK and France have good intelligence capabilities, but they can't really fully replace what the US provides. US military intel sharing has been a massive help to Ukraine, especially with real-time battlefield awareness. Without it, Europe will need to find alternatives, like private satellite imagery contracts or increasing their own intelligence sharing. But again, this is all stuff that takes time and, most importantly, coordination. And the biggest problem for the European Union would be political will. While the US has been a strong leader in coordinating support for Ukraine, Europe doesn't have that same kind of strong leadership. Sure, most countries are still on board, but there are cracks. Countries like Hungary, under Prime Minister Viktor Orban, have openly blocked certain EU aid packages. Slovakia's new government is more pro-Russia and is saying it won't send any more weapons to Ukraine. So if the US pulls back, there's a possibility that these divisions could get worse. But at the same time, there are countries that are right on the front lines. With Russia, Poland, the Baltic states, and Scandinavia, these countries will likely push for even more support. They're going to keep going, with or without the EU's full backing. The key will be whether countries like Germany and France can lead effectively and break through that hesitation. If they don't, we could see a fragmented and weak response to the crisis. When it comes to money, Europe has really stepped up. Even before the US pulls back, Europe has outmatched US military aid, and they've committed to more financial packages to support Ukraine's economy. The EU is working on a multi-year funding plan worth tens of billions, and it's already hosting millions of Ukraine refugees. These financial commitments show that Europe has the capacity to bear some of the burden. If the US really does pull out, Europe might surprise us. They have no choice but to double down and take the lead. The pressure might even spark them to take more decisive action, feeling like they have to step up or risk Ukraine collapsing. In the short term, Europe will have to focus on three major things for Ukraine: ammunition, air defense, and armored vehicles. These are the basics, and if there's any delay in getting these to Ukraine, things could get really bad, really fast. We've already seen what happens when ammo starts running out. Ukrainian artillery has gone quiet on occasion because of a shortage, and if that happens again, Russia could use the silence to push forward. Artillery ammo is the oxygen of the battlefield. That's how important it is. So if Ukraine runs out, they can't fight back effectively, and the front lines will start suffocating. No firepower means no pushback, and Russia could take advantage of that, advancing and threatening key positions. The same goes for the rocket systems like HIMARS. Sure, Ukraine still has some Soviet-era artillery and factories that can produce 152mm shells, but those are already strained. The advanced, precision-guided rockets like GPS-guided ones and Excalibur shells, they're all Western-made ones. Once those run out, Ukraine won't be able to hit targets with the same level of precision anymore. They'll lose one of their biggest advantages in this fight. Air defense is a whole other problem. Ukraine's defense systems, like the Patriots and the SAMs that protect Kyiv, rely heavily on US-made interceptors. If those don't keep coming, the systems won't last more than a few months. Once that happens, Russia's air force and missile units will have free rein to attack more effectively. The Institute for the Study of War even said that air defense, artillery, and anti-armor systems are existential for Ukraine, meaning if they lose these, it could be game over. Without these systems in place, Russia's aerospace forces will be able to do more damage. They've been careful up till now because Ukraine's air defenses have been strong. But if enough of these defenses go quiet, Russia could start going for the kind of carpet bombing we saw in World War II. That's something Ukraine has managed to avoid so far. But if the air defenses fail, Ukraine could see their cities get devastated in no time. Ukraine also needs to keep their Western-supplied tanks, vehicles, and guns in good shape. These things need constant maintenance. The US and its allies have been supplying spare parts and fixing up damaged gear in places like Poland. But if those support lines are cut off, there won't be enough repairs, and tanks and other equipment will break down without getting replaced. A tank that's knocked out on the battlefield might just stay there. And the few Western aircraft Ukraine has, like the Mi-17 helicopters and the F-16 jets, would struggle too if they don't get spare parts. Eventually, Ukraine would have to start conserving its gear. They might even have to fall back on guerrilla tactics in certain areas, which is a tough position to be in when they've been trying to build up a conventional army with Western help. When it comes to intelligence, countries like the UK and France will step in. But here's the thing, US intel is on a whole different level. The global reach and rapid processing of US intelligence has been key for Ukraine. Without that, Ukraine will struggle to get the kind of real-time battlefield awareness that's been so crucial in their success so far. Russia has already adapted by dispersing and hiding their assets to avoid Ukraine's HIMARS strikes. Without US-provided satellite imagery and targeting intel, Russia could start massing forces more boldly, knowing that Ukraine's ability to spot them will be limited. Ukraine will even end up reacting more, instead of making those preemptive strikes that's been so effective. In the long run, Europe can step up. They've got the budgets to do it. Europe's combined defense spending is significant, but it'll take some serious time to ramp up production the way the US has been doing it. But here's the thing. If the US aid dries up completely, it's not the end of Ukraine. They've got a huge army, almost 1 million strong, and they've been building up their own domestic arms industry. Over the years, Ukraine has become really good at improvising and innovating. They could also shift to asymmetric tactics like special forces raids and sabotage behind Russian lines. These tactics might make up for a lack of heavy artillery and tanks. What's clear is that Ukraine's will to fight, it's unbroken. A recent poll shows that most Ukrainians are determined to keep fighting, no matter what the decisions the West makes. A defense analyst from the UK even said, even if Washington pulls back, Ukraine will keep fighting. So Ukraine might have to make some hard decisions. For example, they may focus on defending critical areas like Kyiv and other vital cities, while possibly accepting some temporary losses in less crucial regions due to resource constraints. It might become a war of attrition, where they just hold on and wait for either Europe to fully step in or for the situation in the US to change. But on the other side, how will Russia react if they see the West backing off? It goes without saying that Russia will escalate its efforts from all sides. So far, the Kremlin sees Western support as the biggest hurdle to victory. If that support fades, Putin's going to think that there's an opportunity. We might see Russia launch bigger offenses and take advantage of what they perceive as a weakening of Ukraine. It could be a push to capture all of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, or maybe renewed attacks towards Kharkiv or Zaporizhzhia. Russia has never been shy about throwing troops at a problem, and without US help, they might feel like Ukraine's army can only stretch so far before it breaks, and Russia could get even more aggressive. Some experts worry that Putin could even bring out heavier, more destructive weapons, like thermobaric rockets or, in the worst-case scenario, a tactical nuke. Though using a nuke would also likely risk re-engaging the US, so that's still a line Putin may avoid. But at the same time, if Moscow thinks the West is too fractured to respond, that could make Putin more willing to just push that button. But it doesn't stop there. Russia might also try to test NATO's resolve more directly. Instead of launching a full-scale attack, we could see more aggressive moves like buzzing European airspace with Russian jets or ramping up cyber attacks in NATO countries that are supporting Ukraine. If the US isn't leading NATO with the same force, Putin might think he can get away with risky behavior, testing just how much NATO's really willing to defend. And this brings us to another question. If the US is stepping back, will NATO or some of its European nations send troops to offer more direct military support to Ukraine? Officially, NATO has held firm that it's not a part of the conflict. Its role has been limited to training and providing arms. This has been largely driven by the US wanting to avoid direct confrontation with nuclear-armed Russia. But what happens if the US isn't calling the shots anymore? Could European nations change their approach? It's unlikely that NATO as a whole would deploy troops without US leadership. NATO works on consensus, and the US has always been the de facto leader. Without their participation, NATO would be severely limited in taking any significant military action. The alliance has never gone to war without the US involved, and the likelihood of a formal NATO mission in Ukraine is slim, as long as the US and Canada abstain. However, that doesn't mean it's impossible for European nations to act independently. Some European leaders have started thinking about what would happen if Ukraine's situation becomes dire enough. In an interview with The Economist in late 2023, French President Emmanuel Macron suggested that troops could eventually be deployed if Kyiv needed help after a Russian breakthrough. Just to be clear, this wasn't an actual proposal, it was more of a strategic message. Of course, this idea didn't gain much traction publicly. Other European countries, like Germany, quickly dismissed it. They're worried it could spark World War III. Some security experts believed Macron's statements were part of a broader strategy to inject a bit of uncertainty in the equation. After all, the West had been pretty clear about what it wouldn't do, and Putin could have interpreted that as a green light. Macron's comment, however vague, might have been intended to make Russia think twice. That said, it's also possible that, in the worst case, a coalition of willing European countries like Poland, the Baltic states, or possibly even France could act independently to help Ukraine. But this would be a big step. These countries would have to be prepared to take on serious risk, and they'd have to be sure they were backed, at least tacitly, by the US. Poland has been one of the more outspoken countries when it comes to supporting Ukraine. They've said over and over that Ukraine's fight is Poland's fight. Poland already sent tanks and planes, and they've made sure that their territory is a key hub for aid. The Polish ambassador to NATO even suggested that Europe should continue to talk about sending troops, as it would create a strategic problem for Russia, though he emphasized that it's better to keep supplying weapons and training to avoid needing that option. But at the end of the day, Poland will not act alone, and certainly not without the backing of NATO. Beyond all of this, there's another possibility, in which NATO could expand its advisory and training missions directly inside Ukraine, or even more covert support like special forces. It's no secret that some Western special forces and intelligence units have been operating inside of Ukraine already, mostly to oversee arms deliveries and gather intelligence. But if the US were to leave, European countries could quietly increase their presence, with Britain and France possibly stepping in to help with logistics or operating advanced systems like drones or air defense systems. This wouldn't be combat troops in the trenches, but they'd be more direct support. This kind of mission is something NATO has done before, like when British and Canadian trainers were in Ukraine before the 2022 invasion. But if push comes to shove, and if an outside nation decides to actually deploy combat troops, like say a Polish infantry brigade joins the fight in Donbass, something like that would be a game changer for Ukraine. It would be the first direct involvement in the war, and make no mistake, Russia will respond in the most ruthless way possible. But then again, scenarios like this are at extreme points, and it's almost impossible without US backing. As for Ukraine fighting alone, they're gonna have to be even smarter. If things get really tight, then they'll have to scale back their counteroffensive ambitions and focus on holding the lines. Some experts worry we could end up in a drawn-out stalemate, where neither side can push forward and the front lines just stay bloody and static. But there's also the chance that Ukraine might have to slowly retreat under intense Russian pressure, kind of like what happened with South Vietnam back in 1975 when the aid disappeared. When we talk about the collapse of South Vietnam, we're really talking about the consequences of the United States pulling out of a conflict it had been deeply involved in for years. At the same time, the US had been providing immense military, financial, and logistical support to the South Vietnamese government in their fight against the North. But by 1973, after years of public opposition and increasing domestic pressure over the war, the US signed the Paris Peace Accords. This agreement marked the formal withdrawal of American combat forces from Vietnam. The deal was supposed to bring peace, but in reality, it marked the beginning of the end for South Vietnam. After the US left, American support for South Vietnam began to dwindle. Congress cut funding to the South Vietnamese government by about 30%, significantly reducing their military capacity. The South Vietnamese army, once reliant on the advanced weapons, air support, and training provided by the US, suddenly found itself having to fight the North with much less. By the spring of 1975, the North Vietnamese forces launched a massive offensive. Deprived of the air cover and logistical support the US had provided, South Vietnam's defense collapsed. City after city fell with little resistance, as South Vietnamese soldiers, demoralized and poorly supplied, retreated. The final blow came on April 30th, 1975, when Saigon fell, and the last American helicopters were seen evacuating diplomats and citizens from the rooftops of the US Embassy in a frantic escape. Now, when you look at this event, it's hard not to draw some very uncomfortable parallels to Ukraine today. Yes, Ukraine is in a much stronger position politically and militarily than South Vietnam ever was, but the principle is the same. When a powerful ally pulls out, the results can be disastrous. The key takeaway here is that despite years of US involvement and support, the South Vietnamese army couldn't survive without American backing. Despite having a sizable military force, they simply couldn't keep up when the aid stopped. And remember, this wasn't just about the quantity of the military force. The South Vietnamese army had some 1 million soldiers, but without the necessary support, they couldn't defend against the onslaught of North Vietnam. But let's be clear, Ukraine is not South Vietnam. Ukraine has shown incredible resilience. The country's leadership, especially President Zelensky, has rallied the people and the international community like no other. Ukraine's commitment to its sovereignty and independence is undeniable. And the people have shown, time and time again, that they are willing to sacrifice everything to defend their country. Another historical example is from the Cold War. In 1989, the Soviet Union pulled its troops out of Afghanistan after nearly a decade of involvement. The Soviet-backed communist government in Kabul, led by Najibullah, continued to receive aid from the USSR for a few years. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, that support ended. And the government in Kabul fell quickly to the Mujahideen rebels in 1992. Afghanistan, much like South Vietnam, relied heavily on the Soviet Union for military and economic support. When that support was gone, so was their ability to defend themselves. But even though Afghanistan fell, the consequences for the Afghan people were far worse. The war left Afghanistan in ruins. The country descended into a brutal civil war, and eventually the Taliban took control of the government in the 1990s. The lesson here is that when a superpower cuts off support, not only does the ally suffer, but it also destabilizes the region. creating long-lasting consequences. If the US were to pull out of Ukraine, we could see that same kind of instability. Russia might push harder to gain control of Europe, and other neighboring countries could feel the effects as well. Even after the USSR dissolved in 1991, several of its client states faced severe economic hardships. Cuba, for example, went through a period known as the Special Period in the 1990s, where the country faced food shortages, an energy crisis, and widespread poverty. North Korea, too, experienced famine and economic collapse after the Soviet Union ended its support. So, you get the point, right? When a great power walks away, the consequences can be swift and devastating for its allies. The US pulling back from Ukraine would not only leave the country vulnerable, but it could also embolden Russia to push even further into Europe. Countries that are already under Russian influence, like Moldova and Georgia, might face even more pressure, and the entire region could experience a new wave of instability. But it doesn't end there. If the US pulls out of Ukraine, the geopolitical ramifications would be enormous. For one, Russia would undoubtedly see this as a major victory. Putin has framed the war in Ukraine as a direct challenge to the US and to NATO. If the US abandons Ukraine, Putin would use this as propaganda, claiming that Russia has outlasted the West. He would spin this as a triumph over the Western-backed order. Similarly, even China is closely watching the situation, and if the US pulls back, China might view this as a sign of American weakness. This could enable Beijing to become more assertive in the Indo-Pacific, particularly with Taiwan. In fact, Chinese propaganda has already been pushing the narrative that the US can't be trusted. A US withdrawal from Ukraine would give that narrative even more weight. On top of that, we'd likely see a more divided Europe. If the US pulls back, NATO would be under immense pressure to step up. But NATO, as a collective, has never operated without US leadership. And while countries like Poland, the Baltics, and some others would push for stronger action, the lack of unity within NATO would paralyze the alliance. For Ukraine, the impact would be catastrophic. Without the advanced weaponry and intelligence from the West, Ukraine could be forced into a defensive war, hoping that Europe or NATO would eventually come to its aid. But the longer the conflict drags on, the more Ukraine will find itself at a disadvantage.